Okay, so chapter 7. Now it's now 3:40 a.m. and I am absolutely loving this book. And the last video I made, I said that I was gonna make shorter reviews, but I don't think I can because this chapter turned out to be quite so interesting that I can't really summarize it in few words. So this is a really interesting chapter. It's called Male Love. Now it talks about a whole variety of concepts in here. It discusses the relationship that the men in the encampment have together, and in this chapter it focuses very much on two particular characters called Hank and Felix, and I'm pretty sure they have a form of homosexual or gay relationship. But what is interesting is they mention the work of Foucault, who argues that sexually defined subjectives such as heterosexual and homosexual. So heterosexual, he argues that sexually defined ideas, whether considered normal or taboo, are not the product of a set of natural inclinations. So it's not what we naturally think. It was an example of, and he uses the example of sodomy, because during the Middle Ages it was a confused category, and sodomy sort of relates to the homosexual thing because it is anal sex. So that's an area where it gets a bit more theoretical. Sorry, I'm quite tired. That's an area where it gets a bit more theoretical, and that's quite interesting because what they then go on to say is the homeless at the Edgewater Boulevard didn't really see a contradiction between homophobia and homosexual relationships, because in their, what they refer to in the book as a lumping class category, which is sort of like the category outside the like the middle class and all of these different class systems, it's like really outside. And because they have quite transgressive views from modern society, they don't really see things in quite the same way. And I think it says it allows them to transgress the normal ways of seeing society. So then the rest, or the next bit of this chapter, starts looking in more detail about Hank and I've just been reading this for ages. I'm having a tired moment. Hank and I think, who is it? Hank and Petey. So it starts talking about Hank and Petey, and initially they Petey had a really close running partnership, but I think wasn't actually a gay relationship, but it was like really close relationship with someone else. But then he got on really well with Hank, and I think it was a homosexual relationship. And we really start to dive into their life and see where they lived, and they really describe well the encampment, and like the picture doesn't even do it justice. It does and it doesn't, in the description combined with the picture and combined with the ethnographic account is really well placed together. You really get a sense of like being there, and that really drew me in. These chapters are flying by. As I say, it's really late at night and I want to keep reading because I'm quite upset. Like it really hits your heart, the rest of this chapter, and that's really why I've got to make a longer video, because basically what starts happening is I think it's his name, tired, right, what's Paulie, but what's the guy's name? PT. PT gets really ill, and what happens is you start to see how the hospital system works for them, and this is where it starts to become sad, because you really start to like see how these PT and Hank live together, and Hank starts to become quite ill as well. So before we go into the healthcare system, what they start to talk about is the law enforcement and health. So what really, again, made me even more interested is the very sad situation we see with these cow trains, which, well, I don't know how you pronounce it, but they're like a group of like highway officials who keep evicting them and keep taking all their stuff, and I think it's awful that so many blankets and like bed things are just completely wrecked and ruined. And there's this interesting, I should have noted it down actually, but there's this interesting disparity between the like the authorities' goals. Like this new mayor came in and he wanted to try and, I think, alleviate homelessness and help them, and then as there was more economic growth, he started to cut back on that and started to fund law enforcement. So what was happening was they said to the homeless, if you clean up your homeless areas, we'll leave you alone. And then literally shortly after that, the cow trains came and was like, yeah, thanks for cleaning up for us. And they just like demolished all of their sites. I think there was a reason for it, but I think it was like a change in law enforcement. So then we do start to see this again is why I got quite so interested in this chapter, because you really start to see how these two characters, Hank and PT, are affected by this. So around this time they do start to get ill and they're being moved on like every week or so, or 3 times in like a week or something like that. And that's just deteriorates their health. Now, looking at it from a political standpoint, this is very, very ignorant, in my opinion, from the government, okay? Because what they do is they spend money on evicting them, and then that worsens their health conditions, and then they spend money on the public services and be like, oh, we've got to kick them out sooner, again, worsening their health conditions. But they spend money like trying to help fix their health conditions that they inadvertently created. It's just bloody ridiculous. I mean, I'm not saying that PT and Hank's conditions were solely caused by the cow trains, but they're just made worse. Like, and they're... So, what we continue to see is the way that the different men on the Edgewater Boulevard come and visit PT in hospital, and it's quite interesting because apparently I think it was only the black people on the Edgewater Boulevard came and visited him, along with Hank, and that was quite interesting because it sort of showed again this what I think they refer to in the book is this idea of habitus, the way that the personality that the black people on the Edgewater Boulevard have is that they want to be proactive and they want to go out and they want to do stuff, whereas the white people were more just withdrawn in society and just stayed in this, like, I don't know, it was like the underpass type thing. So it's really quite, it gets a bit more emotional here, where you start to see the devastating effects of like how ill they became, and then they move on to public health budget cuts, which I have already mentioned, but they really go into a bit more depth in explaining how that affected the homeless, because literally hundreds of people were lining up for their medicine like, you know, things they needed to help with diseases and stuff because of shutdowns. And it's really interesting because they say, hold on, it's really interesting because they point out how on a local level there was more spending on law enforcement than on public health. Like they switched the spending, and it's just it's quite sad to see how this actually affects people. Like, I think those of us who live in privileged situations, this book is really making me appreciate that I've never had to worry too much about that, and it is quite sad. So, and then they also point out as well that on a national level, the level of military spending increased, and so the spending on law enforcement and the spending on military spending, that all increased, but the spending on public health just decreased, creating more problems in the US. So it was definitely a very interesting chapter, and hopefully I done it some justice there, because as I've said, I am incredibly tired, but it was very, very interesting and left me really feeling with a sense that there needs to be another way of approaching healthcare, and it's not all about give, give, give. It seems to me it's give and help and save in the future. I maybe I'm getting a bit too political, but I feel like this book really has political implications because it really takes you to a ground level of an absolute situation of poverty and makes you realize these are real fucking people. Like, we are, so many of us are privileged, including me, to not really understand that level of 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 where you just got like barely can't get by and have to accept like steal food. It's very, very interesting. If you read one chapter from this book, read Male Love, chapter 7. It really shows goes into a bit more detail of the characters and shows the situation that they're living in. So thank you for watching.